She was invisible. Just a quiet secretary trying to survive in a world of power, pressure, and secrets. He was the shadow behind the empire. A man feared by everyone, except the one woman who truly saw him. When her boss crosses the wrong line, she's pulled into a dangerous world where protection comes at a price, and love is not gentle, but absolute. This is not a story about innocence. It's a story about choice, about becoming powerful without losing your soul, and about the man who would burn the world to keep one woman safe. Once you enter his world, there is no turning back. If you love intense romance, powerful protectors, and stories where a woman rises instead of breaking, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Comment below. Would you choose a life of safety and power, or walk away from the shadows? The clock on the wall of Grayson Corp didn't tick. It pulsed. A rhythmic reminder that at 23, Becky was a ghost in a machine of glass and steel. It was 8:45 p.m. The panoramic windows of the 50th floor overlooked a city that looked like a spilled box of jewels, but Becky didn't have time to admire the view. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, finalizing a complex financial report that her boss, Julian Grayson, had demanded 3 hours ago, threatening her with dismissal if it wasn't perfect. Becky felt the familiar, dull ache in her temples. She was a woman of routine, precision, and quiet diligence, qualities Julian exploited without a second thought. She had been his secretary for a year, a position she desperately needed to support her ailing mother. To Julian, Becky was an extension of his desk, a tool. In that year, he had never once asked her how she was, only for more coffee, more reports, and more of her time, pushing her emotional reserves to their limit. Her dreams of going back to college felt like a cruel joke, locked away by the intense pressure of her job. "Becky, the file. Now. Bring it," I said. Julian's voice, a sudden booming thunder, tore through the silence of the executive floor from his inner office. The sound wasn't just demanding. It was laced with a raw, unsettling edge of panic that was unusual, even for the volatile CEO. She stood up, her knees stiff with fatigue, and smoothed out her modest, perfectly pressed pencil skirt. She grabbed the heavy, leather-bound folder filled with numbers that seemed to hold the fate of the entire corporation and walked into his office. Julian was pacing, his silk tie slightly askew. He didn't even look up from his phone. He was arguing with someone in a tone of hushed, desperate urgency. "I told you it's handled. Just give me a few more days, you bastard. The numbers are fine," Julian hissed into the expensive receiver, his face pale. His eyes darted nervously around the room, settling on Becky with an almost resentful glare. He snatched the folder from her hand without a thank you, scanning the pages with furious speed. "Go home, and be here at 6 tomorrow. We have the merger meeting. Don't be late." Becky simply nodded, her throat tight with unexpressed exhaustion. "Yes, Mr. Grayson. Good night." She backed out of the room, hearing the last fragment of his panicked conversation. "I don't care about the risk. Just make the transfer. No witnesses." The words sounded like a dangerous threat, chilling her to the bone. She walked out, the silence of the empty office feeling heavy, amplified by Julian's strange fear. As she moved toward her desk to grab her thin coat, she felt a sudden, unmistakable prickle on the back of her neck, the deep, penetrating sensation of being intensely watched. She spun around, her heart nearly hammering against her ribs. Standing silently by the elevators, 20 feet away, was a man. He wasn't Julian, though the sharp line of his powerful jaw and his impressive height suggested a family resemblance. But where Julian was loud and polished, this man was a deliberate shadow. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Becky's yearly salary, tailored perfectly to shoulders that looked capable of carrying immense weight. He wasn't moving. He was just there, leaning against the marble pillar, a figure carved from darkness in the dim hallway light. "The elevators are undergoing maintenance on the north side," the man said. His voice was a shock, deep, impossibly calm, and darkly resonant, like the low, threatening growl of a predator. It was the sound of absolute authority. Becky blinked, her breath catching high in her chest. "Oh, I didn't know. Thank you." She stood there, awkwardly clutching her worn shoulder bag. She had worked here for a year, and Julian hadn't once mentioned this man. Some whispered rumors of a phantom figure who lived in the shadows of the Grayson Empire, a figure only mentioned by old-timers in hushed tones, the one who handled the things Julian's polished hands couldn't touch. Looking at this man now, Becky felt the raw, unrefined danger radiating off him like heat from an engine. The man stepped forward into the soft circle of the light. His eyes were the color of a stormy sea, dark, turbulent, and currently fixed entirely on her. He didn't look at her as if she were a tool. He looked at her as if he were reading the very map of her soul. It was a magnetic gaze that made her feel more intensely seen than she had in her entire life. "You're late, Becky," he said softly. A statement of fact. Her name. He knew her name. "How do you—" "I'm Fred," he interrupted, his voice cutting her off with smooth finality. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, an expression that didn't quite reach the coldness of his eyes. "Julian's brother. Mr. Grayson didn't mention you were coming," she managed to say, struggling to find her professional voice. "Julian mentions very little that actually matters," Fred replied, taking a slow, measured step toward her. He stopped just a few feet away, respecting her personal space, but the air between them was suddenly thick, vibrating with unseen energy. He glanced at her desk, noting the small, pathetic daisy and a glass of water, a tiny act of defiance against the corporate gray. He then looked at her hands, which she was trying, and failing, to keep from trembling. "You haven't eaten since lunch," he stated, a voice of quiet, absolute authority. I had a lot of work, Fred," she said, using his first name for the first time. Fred's brow furrowed slightly. "Julian is a fool," he stated, his voice low. "He has a diamond in his office and treats it like a pebble." Becky's face flushed a deep crimson. The compliment felt monumental. "I'm just doing my job," she repeated, almost defensively. "Fred," he corrected her firmly again, his gaze locking with hers. "Call me Fred." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder for a split second before he pulled it back. A powerful act of restraint. "Go home, Becky. The south elevators are working. And don't worry about the lights. I'll be here until you're safely in your car. I need to ensure the building is secured for Julian's activities." "You don't have to do that," she whispered, the intensity of his focus overwhelming. "I want to," he said, and the sheer raw conviction in his single statement silenced her completely. As she walked toward the elevator, she could feel the relentless weight of his eyes on her back. It was the watchful eye of a guardian. When the elevator doors finally began to close, she caught one last glimpse of him. He was still standing there, unmoving, a dark, tailored sentinel in the middle of the glass palace. He was the most dangerous man she had ever encountered, yet he was the only one in the entire building who seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being. As she drove home, she couldn't shake the image of him. She thought about her frantic boss, Julian, and then she thought about Fred, the way he noticed her hunger, the way he spoke her name, the powerful air of silent protection. She didn't know then that the Grayson Corp was just a front. She didn't know that Fred wasn't just a businessman with a powerful aura. She didn't know that he was the capo of the city's most feared organization, the shadow ruler whose mere presence instilled terror in men like Julian. To the world, he was a monster. But to her, in that moment, he was the first person who had ever looked at her and truly seen her. She was now in the orbit of a man who played by no one's rules but his own, and who had just claimed her as his singular focus. The collision had just begun. The morning arrived with a thin, sharp layer of frost over the city, but Becky felt an unfamiliar heat of anticipation. She was exhausted, yet energized by the events of the previous night. She arrived at the office precisely at 6, the earliest she had ever been. She checked the entire floor. Empty. The air was sterile, with no lingering scent of expensive cologne, no charcoal soot leaning against the marble. It was as if Fred had been a powerful, vivid hallucination. Julian walked in 30 minutes later, looking terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jerky, and his entire demeanor screamed of a sleepless night spent panicking. He didn't acknowledge Becky's presence, merely throwing his briefcase onto his desk and slamming his office door shut, the sound echoing unnervingly through the large space. Becky tried to settle into her routine, but the work felt meaningless, a distraction from the new, dangerous reality she had stumbled into. As she was compiling the morning's agenda, her computer, usually a flawless machine, abruptly froze. The screen went dark, then rebooted, but before the corporate logo appeared, a single short message flashed across the black screen. "Look up, Piccola." Becky's breath hitched. She instinctively glanced up. Fred was standing by the glass partition that separated her area from the main elevator bank. He was dressed in a dark, formidable overcoat, his hands tucked into his pockets. He hadn't used the main entrance. He had simply materialized. He gave her a single, sharp nod, a silent communication that sent a jolt of recognition and excitement through her. Julian's door burst open. "Becky, where's my itinerary? I need the file for the 8 o'clock meeting." Fred's eyes, still locked on Becky, narrowed instantly. The soft look replaced by a glacial disapproval that was meant for his brother. He didn't move or make a sound, but his gaze was a command. Becky turned to Julian, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "The file is on your desk, Mr. Grayson. I placed it there yesterday evening." Julian, blinded by his own stress, glared at her, then slammed his door shut again. Fred finally walked toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate, crossing the marble floor with the grace of a hunter. He stopped right beside her desk, placing his large hand flat on the cool, polished wood, not touching her, but marking his territory. "He doesn't feed you," Fred stated, his voice a low, gravelly observation. "He doesn't respect your time." "Why do you stay?" "I need the job," Becky answered honestly, looking at the large, dangerous hand resting inches from her own. "My mother is ill. This job pays the bills." Fred's expression shifted, a flicker of something close to pain crossing his features. A debt of duty, a noble sickness. He withdrew his hand. "I understand duty." He reached into the pocket of his overcoat and pulled out a small, heavy paper bag. He placed it gently on her desk. "Eat. It is not duty to starve." Becky looked at the bag. It wasn't the usual takeout fare. It was a single, warm, flaky croissant and a small container of fresh berries, the exact breakfast she used to treat herself to on rare, good days. "Thank you, Fred," she whispered, the simple gesture of care from this man of shadows overwhelming her. He didn't wait for her to eat. He simply stared at her for a long, silent moment, his eyes absorbing every detail of her face, her uniform, her quiet exhaustion. It was a silent conversation that lasted an eternity. "I will see you soon, Becky," he murmured. He didn't say goodbye. It was a promise, a soft, dangerous warning. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the main elevator bank as silently as he had arrived. Becky watched him go, then slowly opened the paper bag. The croissant was still warm. The simple act felt like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. She understood the exchange now. Julian offered money and fear. Fred offered protection and profound, silent recognition. She was falling, not for the corporate bigwig, but for the man who saw her worth, the man whose danger was only ever directed outward, in a fierce, protective circle around her. The pattern was now set. Julian's panic escalated daily, a visual cue of the mounting danger surrounding the Grayson family, while Fred's presence became the dark, comforting anchor in Becky's chaotic life. Fred never stayed for long. He appeared in the early mornings or late evenings, always unannounced, always silent, and always with a small, unexpected gift. A rare book for her long-deferred studies, a luxurious, untouched bar of dark chocolate, or a new, heavy-duty phone simply programmed to his number and one emergency contact. These gifts were not courtship. they were a quiet, insistent declaration of ownership and care. Becky never saw him speak to Julian, but the effect of his visits on the CEO was palpable. Julian stopped demanding coffee. He stopped asking Becky to stay past 7 p.m. He seemed to fear her desk as much as he feared the dark alleys of the city. Becky knew Fred was using his immense power to carve out a pocket of safety for her. One afternoon, Julian was preparing for an important dinner with a powerful old money family, a meeting that felt less like business and more like a desperate plea for help. He was meticulously dressed, but his hands were shaking as he fixed his cufflink. "Becky," Julian called, his voice barely above a nervous whisper. "My cufflink. It's jammed. Fix it." Becky walked over, her professional detachment masking a deep discomfort. As she leaned in to untangle the tiny mechanism, she felt the sudden, unnerving weight of a heavy proprietary gaze on her. She looked up, straight into the eyes of Fred, who was standing in the doorway of Julian's office. He had simply materialized, as always, an overwhelming presence in the formal corporate space. His eyes, the color of a cold, deep sea, were fixed on Becky's close proximity to his brother. The look was one of absolute, terrifying disapproval. Julian, sensing the silent judgment, jumped back as if he had been burned. "Fred, you're early. I see what you were doing, Julian." Fred cut him off, his voice low and dangerous, a sound that made Becky's breath catch. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone was more potent than any shout. "Let her go." Julian visibly swallowed, his panic now directed entirely at his brother. "Of course, I was just leaving. Becky, go home, now." Becky quickly gathered her things. She could feel the silent, intense conflict raging between the two men. As she passed Fred in the doorway, he didn't touch her, but his eyes locked onto hers, a flash of both warning and fierce, unyielding protection. She walked quickly to the elevator, but before the doors could close, Fred's hand shot out, holding them open. He stepped in, his height immediately making the small steel box feel impossibly crowded. Julian was left standing in the office doorway, watching them descend with a look of terrified resentment. The silence in the elevator was heavy, charged with the energy of their forbidden proximity. Fred stood too close, but not close enough to violate her space. He smelled of expensive leather, cold air, and something subtly smoky, a scent that had become synonymous with danger and comfort. "He does not touch you again," Fred commanded, his voice a low, rough rumble. "He was just asking me to fix his cufflink," Becky replied, her voice steady. "It does not matter," Fred stated, his gaze unwavering. "He does not have the right to claim your time or your space. No one does." The statement was a declaration, not just of protection, but of the intense, possessive desire that was growing between them. "And who has that right, Fred?" Becky challenged, looking up into his formidable, unyielding eyes. Fred's expression shifted, the intensity in his eyes softening just a fraction, revealing a profound, complicated need. He didn't answer with words. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering for a brief electric second. It was a purely tender, non-aggressive touch that spoke volumes about his restraint and his desire. "Only the one who has everything to lose for you," he murmured, his voice husky. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor. The guards in the lobby snapped to attention, their eyes wide with fear and respect. Fred simply nodded at them, a silent acknowledgement of his power. He walked Becky out to the curb, a protective shadow keeping her shielded from the hostile city. He had ordered a driver for her, a sleek, unmarked black sedan. "Go home, Becky," he commanded, opening the car door for her. "And do not worry about Julian. He will not trouble you again." She got in, her heart pounding with the conflicting emotions of fear and utter devotion. As the car pulled away, she looked back. Fred was still standing on the curb, watching the car until it disappeared into the traffic. He was a silent sentinel, a dark figure of formidable power, rooted to the spot by a pure, unyielding sense of duty toward her. Becky knew her life had fundamentally changed. She was falling for a man who ruled in the shadows, a man who offered safety in a world he made dangerous. The price of his protection was a life forever changed, but the reward was the singular, consuming focus of his immense power. She was no longer just the secretary. She was becoming the most cherished possession of the capo. The next day, the office was unnaturally calm. Julian did not appear. Becky received a terse, impersonal email from the corporate legal team stating that Julian Grayson was taking an indefinite leave of absence due to an urgent family matter. The CEO was gone. Fred's silent intervention had been decisive and absolute. Becky understood the meaning. The man who had been the source of her stress and the main connection to her old life had been surgically removed. The only remaining tension was the knowledge of the secret she held. She was now the solitary link between the two Graysons, the silent witness to the true power that ran the city. In the late afternoon, as she was preparing to leave, Fred walked into the office. He wasn't dressed in a suit, but in a heavy charcoal overcoat that made him look like a formidable warrior. He looked tired, the exhaustion etched around his cold, deep-set eyes, but his focus on her was immediate and unwavering. "Pack your desk, Becky," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "You no longer work here." Becky felt a sudden cold panic. "Fred, I need the money. My mother—" "The money is handled," he cut her off, walking over to her desk. He placed a thick, sealed envelope on the pristine surface. "The family will cover all of your mother's expenses, her medical bills, her care. You will not want for anything, ever again. But you will not return to this place." He leaned in, his gaze intense, a powerful statement of possessive control. "This building is contaminated, Becky. Julian's carelessness has made it a target. I cannot risk you being here. You are coming with me." "Coming with you where?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and reluctant excitement. "To a place where the walls are thick, the gates are secured, and the only man who has access is me," he stated, his voice absolute. "You will be safe, and you will be free to focus on your studies. This is not up for debate." He reached out and gently took her hand, his palm warm and rough against her smaller one. The gesture was a soft command. "Trust me, Piccola. I know what is best for you." Becky looked at his eyes, the eyes of a man who held the city in his hands, but whose only weakness was the small, ordinary woman standing before him. She felt the fear, but it was eclipsed by the terrifying, intoxicating draw of his protection. She squeezed his hand once, a silent agreement. "I trust you, Fred." He gave her a single, sharp nod, his lips curving into a ghost of a smile. A rare and precious sight. He let go of her hand and began to quickly, efficiently, clear her desk himself, placing her few personal items into her shoulder bag. He worked with the controlled speed of a man who was used to leaving no trace behind. He led her out of the deserted office, past the terrified security guards, and into the waiting black sedan. As they drove out of the city, away from the glass and steel, and into the deepening twilight, Becky knew she had traded her simple life for a dangerous new beginning. She was now under the complete, absolute protection of the capo. The journey out of the city was long and silent. The black sedan drove into the hills, leaving behind the glittering chaos for a quiet, remote opulence. They arrived at a property Becky had only ever seen in magazines, a modern fortress of stone and dark glass, blending into the towering pines. It was a safe house, not a home, but it was Fred's territory, and it radiated the formidable power of the man who ruled there. Inside, the house was vast, minimal, and chillingly impersonal. It was a space designed for strategy and defense, not comfort. Fred led her directly to a guest suite that was larger than her former apartment, featuring a massive 4-poster bed, a private library, and a balcony with an impossible view of the twinkling cityscape below. It was a beautiful, isolated prison. "This is your space, Becky," Fred stated, his voice a low command. "It is secure. The windows are reinforced, the doors are locked from the outside, and the only man who has access is me. You will not leave this property without my escort. Not for any reason." Becky set her small bag down on the pristine rug. The absolute control he exerted was terrifying, but the security felt like a necessary shield after the events of the last few days. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "And what do I do here, Fred? I don't work for you anymore." Fred walked toward her, stopping just inches away. His shadow fell over her, a massive protective presence. "You study, Becky. You live. You breathe. Julian stunted you. I won't. I will give you the safety to focus on the life you were meant to have." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a brief possessive gesture that spoke of his absolute claim. "You are safe here, Piccola. That is all that matters." He withdrew his hand and turned toward the door. "I will have one of my men bring dinner. I have work to do. Do not leave this suite." The command was absolute, leaving no room for argument. Becky was left alone with the crushing silence of the vast, secured space. The feeling of being completely dependent on the most dangerous man in the city was both suffocating and strangely intoxicating. She spent the first few days adjusting to the new reality. She began her online studies, grateful for the encrypted laptop he had provided. She saw Fred only in the evenings. He would appear at her door, often long after midnight, looking tired and drawn, the scent of cold night air and expensive cigars clinging to his clothes. He would sit with her while she ate the dinner his men prepared, and he would listen to her talk about her studies, about her mother, about anything and everything that was not the Mafia. These were the moments of true, quiet intimacy. He did not speak of his business, but in his intense, unwavering gaze, Becky saw the burden of his command, the constant strain, the perpetual wariness. He was a monster to the world, but in her presence, he allowed himself to be a man seeking refuge. One evening, he was more distant than usual. He sat by the large window, staring out at the cityscape, his posture rigid. Becky knew, instinctively, that the conflict with Julian and his allies was far from over. "Fred," she called softly, "tell me about your mother." The question surprised him. He turned, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "Why?" "Because you remember everything about me," she replied. "And you said you understood duty. I want to understand yours." Fred hesitated, then slowly walked to the fireplace, leaning his elbow on the mantelpiece. "My mother was a woman of absolute grace, a simple artist, but married to a man who ruled in the shadows. She hated the life, but she was loyal to the end. She taught me that loyalty is the only thing that matters, even when it costs you everything." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She died when I was 20. Julian and we took over. Julian took the face of the business. I took the responsibility for the shadows." Becky's heart ached for the boy who had been forced to become the capo. "And what was her name?" "Alessandra," he murmured. "She loved the quiet. She loved beauty." He looked up at Becky, and the tenderness in his eyes was almost unbearable. "When I look at you, I see the quiet she cherished. I see the beauty that should never be tainted by this world. That is why I brought you here, Becky, to keep you in the light she loved." The confession was a powerful, devastating act of trust. Becky understood that her purpose in his life was not merely romantic, it was spiritual. She was his link to the purity he had lost. She stood up and walked toward him, closing the final physical distance. She did not speak. She simply placed her hands on his chest, right over his heart, and looked up into his formidable, unyielding eyes. Fred's powerful body remained rigid for a moment. Then, with a low, ragged sigh, he broke. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair. He held her with a desperate, crushing intensity that spoke of his loneliness, his fear, and his absolute dependence on her quiet strength. He didn't speak of love or passion. He spoke of duty, loyalty, and silence. But in that crushing embrace, Becky felt the truth. This man of shadows was deeply, terrifyingly in love with her, and she was the only one who could offer him peace. He finally pulled back, his eyes blazing with a mixture of desire and self-control. He gently framed her face with his hands. "You are my peace, Becky. Never leave me. Never leave this house. I cannot risk losing you." He lowered his head and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss on her forehead. It was a kiss of protection, a silent vow of ownership and devotion. He released her abruptly, turning quickly to hide the intense emotion on his face. "I need to go to the city tonight," he commanded, his voice back to the low, absolute authority of the capo. "The betrayal is complex. I will be gone until morning. Do not open the door for anyone but Marco. He will be on guard outside your suite." Becky nodded, her heart full of the knowledge of his burden. "Be careful, Fred. For both of us." He gave her a single, sharp nod and walked out, his steps echoing down the long, silent corridor. Becky was left alone, but she was no longer lonely. She was the keeper of the capo's heart, and the only person he trusted with the secret of his vulnerability. The gilded cage was now a sanctuary, and she was the queen of the shadows. The house settled into a deep, oppressive silence after Fred's departure. Becky, restless, wandered into the private library attached to her suite. The collection was vast, dedicated primarily to classical literature and Renaissance history, a startling contrast to the man who commanded violence and darkness. She picked a volume of Dante, its binding worn and ancient. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a small, faded black-and-white photograph. It was a picture of a young Fred, no older than 10, sitting beside a beautiful woman with gentle, sad eyes. Alessandra. The sight of the woman, so elegant and fragile, intensified Becky's understanding of his fierce protective nature. She was about to close the book, when a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the house, a sound that was unmistakably a heavy exterior door closing, followed by the clatter of shoes on the marble floor. It was too soon for Fred to return. Becky froze, clutching the book. She hurried to the secure phone he had given her and pressed the single dedicated button. No answer. Marco, his guard, was silent. A moment later, a shadow fell across her door. A soft, insistent knock followed. "Becky? It's Julian. He left a note for you. I was asked to deliver it." The voice was not Marco's. It was unfamiliar, smooth, and utterly sinister. Becky's heart hammered against her ribs. Julian was supposed to be gone, exiled, but his desperation had clearly made him a weapon for Fred's enemies. "I don't know you. You should leave," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, but I think you do." The voice chuckled, low and mocking. "We are the friends of your old boss, and we are here to retrieve a certain file." The sound of a heavy tool being placed against the lock echoed through the silence. Becky felt the full, cold terror of her new reality. The safe house was a fortress, but the enemy was at the door, brought by the man who shared Fred's blood. She was alone, isolated, and the danger was no longer a shadow. It was a terrifying, immediate presence. She scrambled to the balcony door, locked it, then stood in the middle of the room, scanning the space for any weapon. Her eyes landed on the heavy, brass fireplace poker. She ran and grabbed it, her simple secretary's hands tightening around the cold metallic weight. The door buckled with a loud, sickening crack. The heavy oak door to Becky's suite buckled with a loud, splintering crack. The danger was no longer a chilling rumor. It was a terrifying physical reality. Becky stood in the center of the vast, quiet room, her heart hammering against her ribs, the heavy, brass fireplace poker clutched in her trembling hands. She was a secretary, not a warrior, but the primal instinct to survive and protect the precious, fragile peace Fred had given her was stronger than her fear. The door finally gave way, flying inward with a violent crash. 2 men, large, menacing figures with cold, empty eyes, stepped into the suite. They were not subtle. They were professional mercenaries, and their presence filled the luxurious space with an immediate, suffocating threat. "The file, ragazza. We know Julian gave it to you," one of the men, the leader, commanded, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Give it up and we leave. No one gets hurt." Becky knew they weren't interested in a file. They were interested in her, the single, soft vulnerability of the capo. She raised the heavy poker, a clumsy, inadequate shield. "I don't have a file." "You should leave," she managed, her voice shaking but holding steady. The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Such loyalty for the capo. You have learned fast." He lunged forward. Becky reacted on pure adrenaline. She didn't strike, but swung the poker wildly, creating distance and forcing the man to pause. The distraction was enough. As the two men advanced, Becky dodged past them, running toward the corridor, screaming Fred's name, a desperate, raw cry that echoed off the stone walls of the fortress. The men tackled her just as she reached the door. She fought with a sudden, fierce desperation, kicking and struggling, the terrifying fear of being captured by Fred's enemies giving her a brutal, primal strength. The struggle was quick, violent, and contained. The men easily overpowered her, pinning her to the ground, their hands grasping her arms. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the leader warned, reaching for the fabric of her dress. Suddenly, a sound like a physical explosion tore through the silence of the corridor, the unmistakable, violent sound of a heavy exterior door being ripped from its hinges. "Get away from her!" "Fred." His voice was a raw, unfiltered roar of animalistic fury, a sound Becky had never heard, a voice that belonged only to the capo defending his most cherished territory. He burst into the suite, his clothes torn, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes blazing with a singular murderous intent. He had returned early on instinct, on the one rule he lived by: protect Becky. The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal, and kept just beyond the visual scope of Becky's immediate terror. She heard the brutal impact of bodies colliding, the grunts of pain, and the sound of bodies hitting the stone floor with devastating finality. The room was consumed by the sound of pure, unadulterated violence, a raw, terrifying demonstration of the capo's power. Becky lay on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes squeezed shut until the silence returned. A heavy, absolute silence that spoke of total annihilation. She finally opened her eyes. Fred stood over her, his chest heaving, his dark shirt torn, blood visible on his hands and cheek. But his focus was only on her. He did not look at the still forms on the floor. His world was centered entirely on her safety. He walked to her, knelt, and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his warm, blood-scented body. "I told you to be safe. I told you I would protect you. I should have never left," he choked out, his voice thick with a self-directed fury. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of sandalwood and cold rain, the raw fear finally giving way to profound, shattering relief. "Julian," she whispered, her voice tight with sobs. "He sent them. He betrayed you." Fred's grip tightened on her, a chilling finality in his movement. "He will never trouble you again, Becky. The price for touching what is mine is eternal." He gently pulled back, framing her face with his large, powerful, and now clean hands. His eyes, the storm, were focused only on her, searching for damage, for fear, for the single truth of her safety. "The Contessa is a political necessity. You," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that stripped him of his power. "You are my soul. You are my only truth." He lowered his head, not for a kiss of passion, but for a kiss of desperate relief and absolute claim. His lips found hers, a fierce, tender pressure that was a silent vow. It was the moment of their ultimate surrender, Becky to his protection, and Fred to his deepest vulnerability. It was the first kiss, a baptism of fire and devotion. He released her, pulling her close and lifting her into his arms. He carried her out of the blood-stained room and into his private suite, away from the evidence of the world he was forced to command. In Fred's massive private suite, the danger felt distant, replaced by an intense, overwhelming intimacy. Fred placed her gently on the enormous bed, his movements careful, almost reverent. He immediately moved to the bathroom, returning moments later with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He knelt by the bed, his formidable frame humbled by the task of tending to her. He didn't speak as he gently cleaned the small cuts and bruises on her arms, his focus absolute. His silence was a new kind of communication, a language of duty, care, and total devotion. "I'm sorry," Becky whispered, her voice raw. "I brought this danger to you." Fred looked up, his eyes sharp. "You brought nothing but light, Becky. The danger was always here. I am the danger. I brought you into my storm, and I will be the one who shields you from the rain." He finished cleaning her, then sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and gently ran the back of his fingers across her cheek, his touch feather-light. "You need to know the truth now, Piccola. I am the capo. I rule this city in the shadows. My word is law. The men who came here were sent by a rival family, using Julian's desperate greed as a weapon. This life is not one of simple elegance. It is one of perpetual war." Becky reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I know, Fred. I found the file. I found the truth." Fred's eyes narrowed, a coldness returning. "And you still stay?" "Because you are here," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Because you are a man who commands an empire. But your greatest strength is the tenderness you only show to me. You are a monster to the world, but you are the kindest man I have ever known." The honesty was a final, complete surrender, and it was the ultimate truth that broke through the capo's defenses. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Then you will never leave my sight," he commanded, his voice a low, fierce vow. "I will not let you. I cannot survive if you are harmed. You are my anchor, Becky. You are my only truth." He spent the rest of the night beside her, not in passion, but in a heavy, protective presence. He simply held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his heartbeat a steady, powerful rhythm beneath her ear. In the darkest hour of the night, the powerful capo found his only solace in the quiet strength of the simple secretary. She was no longer the innocent protected in a gilded cage. She was the one truth in the heart of the Mafia, and her life, for better or worse, was now irrevocably bound to the man who controlled the city's shadows. The morning after the attack was the dawn of a new, irreversible reality. The suite was quiet, and the sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating the man beside her. Fred was awake, watching her with an intensity that was both terrifying and intimate. He was dressed, his body a formidable mass of coiled muscle beneath the fabric of his dark clothes. "I have arranged a cleanup team," Fred stated, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "There will be no trace of last night. The men Julian sent will not be an issue again." Becky sat up, pulling the sheet to her chest. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a new, sober understanding. "Julian is still an issue, Fred. He betrayed you once. He will keep using his connections to bring more danger to this house." Fred sighed, a low, frustrated sound. He rose and walked to the window, staring out at his vast, secure territory. "He is my blood, Becky. I cannot simply execute him, but I cannot allow him to continue his betrayal. He leaves me no choice but exile or war." Becky climbed out of bed, pulling on a silk robe that Fred had quietly placed in the closet. She walked to him, her simple, composed presence a powerful contrast to his turbulent internal conflict. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the city they both knew was ruled by his hand. "There is a third choice, Fred. Ruin," she stated, her voice clear and strong. "You don't need to fight him with violence. You fight him with the structures he tried to exploit. You ruin his reputation, cut off his finances, and force his allies to abandon him without a single drop of blood being shed by your men. You show the families that the capo's intelligence is a better weapon than his ruthlessness." Fred turned, his eyes fixed on hers, the coldness in his gaze slowly replaced by a profound, calculating respect. "You have a plan," he stated, his voice a low rumble of surprise. "I have the knowledge," Becky confirmed. "Julian made a fundamental mistake. He used the old family accounts, the ones tied to the legitimate corporate structure. I worked on those reports for a year. I know the legal loopholes he is using, the ones he learned from watching his own brother. I can help you build the case. I can find the legal means to bankrupt him, publicly, legally, so his allies see his weakness and abandon him without you having to fire a single shot. This was the moment of their true partnership. Becky was offering him a path to victory that honored his commitment to nonviolence against his blood, while ensuring the absolute security of his empire and their safety. Fred had fallen for the secretary, but he was choosing the partner. Fred reached out, his large hands resting gently on her shoulders, his grip possessive but tender. You are a terrifying woman, Becky, and you are mine. I accept. We will do this your way. Show me. He led her to his command center, a private office where the city's power lines terminated. For the rest of the day, the two worked in intense, silent focus. Fred, the capo, sat side by side with Becky, the former secretary, poring over ancient corporate law and complex financial structures. He was the force, and she was the mind, a seamless fusion of power and intellect. Their collaboration was an act of profound intimacy. Fred would watch her work, a look of fierce pride on his face. When she needed a source, he would retrieve the required text instantly. When she needed a break, he would place a glass of water and a pastry on her desk, his touch brief but lingering. The moments of shared focus were deeper than any words or touch. They were building an empire, not with blood, but with mutual respect. Late that evening, Becky leaned back in her chair, a look of exhaustion and triumph on her face. I found it, Fred. The way to bankrupt him, legally, without anyone questioning the liquidation. A loophole in the old family trust allows you, as the primary heir, to fully divest the asset Julian is using. The Veneto will abandon him by morning when they realize his funds have vanished. Fred didn't look at the screen. He looked only at her. He pulled her gently from the chair and sat her on his lap. He leaned in, his lips finding hers in a long, slow, and deeply satisfying kiss. This kiss was not the desperate relief of the night before. It was a kiss of profound gratitude and a silent confirmation of their unbreakable partnership. The business is finished, Fred murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But the matter of us, that is just beginning. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to his private suite. The danger remained, but the fear was replaced by the exhilarating certainty that she was not just protected by the capo. She was his true, necessary strength. The following days were dedicated to the flawless execution of Becky's plan. Fred deployed his best legal minds, but he insisted on Becky's oversight of every detail. He trusted her diligence, her moral compass, and her quiet fierceness more than any lawyer the family employed. The strategy was devastatingly effective. Julian's assets vanished into legal ether, his lines of credit were severed, and the Veneto, realizing they had aligned with a man of no resources, retreated. Julian's war was over before it began, ended by a single intelligent stroke of a pen. The aftermath was a period of intense intimacy for Becky and Fred. The victory had stripped away the last vestiges of his need for distance. He no longer spent nights in the command center. He spent them with Becky, his powerful arms wrapped around her, his head resting against her hair. One rainy morning, Fred returned from a short, necessary trip to the city. He walked into their suite, a somber look on his face. "Julian is gone," he stated, his voice low. "I sent him to live far from here. He has no money, no title, no power. He will live a quiet, insignificant life under a different name, always watched, but safe from the consequences of his betrayal." That was the mercy of the capo. Becky walked to him and gently touched his cheek. She saw the pain of a brother's betrayal in his eyes, and she honored his difficult act of mercy. "You are a good man, Fred," she whispered. "A better man than he deserved." Fred's grip on her tightened, pulling her close. "No," he corrected, his voice raw. "I am a ruthless man who is trying to be good for one woman. Don't confuse the two, Becky. But I will always be the best man for you." He paused, a rare, profound hesitation. I need to tell the other families about you. They see you as a vulnerability. I need to show them you are a weapon. The Contessa, Becky stated, her voice even. You need to show them why I am not a threat to the treaty. The Contessa is finished, Fred declared, his voice absolute. She was a political necessity for Julian, but the need for her is gone. The old families will try to replace her. I need to show them why there can be no replacement. He led her to the massive walk-in closet in his suite. He opened a compartment she had never seen before, a secure space filled not with weapons, but with the most exquisite, elegant gowns and jewelry she had ever seen. You will meet the heads of the families with me, Fred commanded, his eyes shining with a possessive pride. You will be my partner, my strength, the woman who saved the family from internal destruction. You will be the queen of the shadows, and they will fear the mind that controls the capo. He reached for a dress, a deep sapphire blue, simple in its cut, but devastating in its elegance. Wear this, Becky. Tonight, you will show the world the truth of my choice. The night of the assembly was the culmination of everything Becky and Fred had built in the shadows. It was not a party or a gala. It was a formal gathering of the heads of the city's old families, a cold, calculated event where power was measured in silence and allegiance. It was where Becky would be formally presented, not as a mistress or a secretary, but as the woman who had saved the capo's reign. In their suite, the air was thick with anticipation. Becky stood before the mirror, dressed in the sapphire blue gown Fred had chosen. The cut was simple, elegant, and spoke of a quiet confidence that was more potent than any lavish display. The color was a devastating complement to her dark hair and pale skin. Fred had placed a single item of jewelry on her, a simple antique silver locket that belonged to his mother, Alessandra, a silent, profound gesture of acceptance into the most sacred part of his life. Fred stood behind her, impeccably dressed in a black tailored suit that seemed less like clothing and more like armor. He did not speak, but his presence filled the room with a protective, dominating energy. I'm nervous, Becky confessed, her voice barely a whisper. They will see me as weak, as a soft target. Fred placed his hands on her bare shoulders, his touch a silent anchor. He leaned in, his lips brushing the sensitive skin near her ear. They will see what I allow them to see, Mia Regina. You are the woman who broke the betrayal of my blood, not with a gun, but with your mind. They will respect your intelligence, and they will fear the ruthlessness of the man who protects it. He turned her to face him, his eyes blazing with an intense, possessive pride. You will not hide, Becky. You will stand beside me. You will meet their eyes. You will be silent unless spoken to. You will be elegant, and you will be terrifying, because you are mine. He lowered his head and claimed her lips in a deep, possessive kiss. It was a kiss of command and total commitment, a silent confirmation of their unbreakable bond before facing the world. When the kiss ended, he led her out. The assembly was held in the family's oldest estate, a place of dark wood, heavy velvet, and profound, silent history. The atmosphere was one of tense, measured scrutiny. Becky walked into the main hall on Fred's arm. Her hand rested on his forearm, a small, elegant anchor against the sheer power radiating from him. The hall went silent. The men in the room, the heads of the old families, turned as one, their gazes sharp, assessing, and brutally cold. They expected to see a trophy, a frivolous distraction. Instead, they saw a woman of quiet, formidable composure, standing tall, wearing the capo's mother's locket. Fred did not speak or introduce her immediately. He simply allowed her presence to settle, a master of psychological warfare. He led her to the central table, pulling out a chair for her before taking his own, an act of chivalry that was a clear, public statement of respect. The assembly began, a hushed, formal discussion of the city's new territorial divisions. Fred spoke with a ruthless clarity, dismantling the remnants of Julian's betrayal with sharp, devastating logic. He was a force of nature, but the power in the room was subtly shifted. Every man there was watching Becky, trying to decipher the nature of her influence. Midway through the meeting, an old, formidable man, the head of the oldest, most conservative family, finally addressed her. "Signorina," the man said, his voice cold and patronizing. "We understand you were instrumental in the recent unfortunate events. You are a clever woman, but in this world, cleverness is a liability. It creates risk." Becky met his gaze, remembering every lesson Fred had given her about silence and composure. She paused for a measured moment, then spoke, her voice clear and low, filling the hushed hall. "Cleverness is not a liability, signore," Becky countered, using the appropriate formality. "Weakness is. I eliminated the weakness from the heart of the family, the financial weakness, the betrayal. I brought stability without bloodshed, which is more than any man in this room can claim. I am not a risk to the structure. I am the insurance of its stability." A slow, stunned silence fell over the room. She had not only spoken, but had used the language of power and strategy, affirming her utility to the entire enterprise. Fred smiled, a cold, sharp, and terrifying expression of pure pride that was directed only at her. He placed his hand over hers on the table, a public, possessive claim. "The matter is closed," Fred stated, his voice absolute. "Signorina Becky is my partner. She is the capo's stability. Any man who questions her role questions my command. Is that understood?" The question was not a request. It was an order. The men, intimidated by the combined force of the capo's absolute ruthlessness and the unexpected sharpness of his queen, nodded in silent, grudging assent. The assembly was dismissed. As they walked out, the air was crackling with the new truth. Becky had faced the most dangerous men in the city and had defined her own role with courage and intelligence. They returned to the safe house in the early hours of the morning. The journey was silent, but the air in the car was thick with triumphant tension. Fred did not speak until they were back in their private suite. He closed the door, walked to her, and simply pulled her into a long, deep embrace, holding her tightly against his chest. "You were magnificent, Becky," he murmured into her hair. "You saved me from a war. You saved me from myself." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate intensity. He reached up and gently touched the silver locket around her neck. "My mother would have loved you. She would have seen the grace beneath the armor. You are everything good I have left to protect." Becky reached up and framed his face with her hands, pulling him closer. "You didn't need a Contessa, Fred. You needed a partner, and I need a purpose. We gave that to each other tonight." He lowered his head and claimed her lips again, this time with a deep, consuming passion that spoke of the final, complete erasure of his internal resistance. It was the kiss of two people who had found their absolute truth in the darkest of places. The tension, the fear, and the silence were finally shattered by the overwhelming honesty of their shared love. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to their bed. The simple secretary had become the capo's queen, not by birthright, but by the undeniable power of her mind and the fierce, protective love of the man who ruled the shadows. Her life was no longer about survival. It was about dominion, shared with the most dangerous, most devoted man she had ever known. The weeks following the assembly were a period of intense, consuming stability. Becky's role was officially solidified. She was the capo's partner, the silent strategist behind the empire's legitimate face. She worked from the safe house, restructuring the Grayson corporate wealth, her financial genius securing Fred's absolute dominance in the city. The other families no longer questioned her. They feared her quiet intelligence and the ruthless protection it earned from Fred. Their life together settled into a routine of paradoxical intimacy. By day, they were a seamless force of strategy and power, their shared focus on the empire a new form of courtship. Fred would pull up the complex financial ledgers, and Becky would dissect them, pointing out vulnerabilities with a quiet confidence that made him look at her with unreserved pride. By night, they retreated into the private sanctuary of their suite, where the power dynamics melted away, leaving only the profound tenderness of two people who had found solace in each other's arms. Fred's possessiveness remained absolute, but it was now expressed through acts of pure devotion. He ensured her studies progressed, demanding excellence and providing every resource. He would spend hours in the library, simply watching her read, the silent act a testament to the fact that her peace and growth were his highest priority. He often told her, "My strength is my command, but my greatest power is the peace you give me." Becky's life was now one of unimaginable luxury: expensive clothes, freedom from financial worry, and the constant security of the capo's personal guard. But her greatest treasure remained the quiet moments, the mornings when Fred would wake before her, his massive arm draped over her, his forehead resting on her hair, the low, steady rhythm of his heartbeat a comforting sound. One quiet afternoon, as Becky was reviewing financial reports, a large antique wooden chest was delivered to the house. It was a package from Europe, delivered by a man with cold, formal manners. Fred was in the command center, and Becky, intrigued, opened the chest herself. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was the most exquisite antique diamond necklace Becky had ever seen, a piece clearly intended for a queen. Attached was a note, written on expensive, heavy paper, with a distinct, elaborate European seal. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and utterly cold. The note was from Contessa Isolde. "I trust you are enjoying the spoils of war. Keep the trinket. It is a fitting reward for a clever distraction. However, understand this. The alliance between the families is a river that can be diverted, but never stopped. He will always need an equal, not a comfort. I am arranging a final, formal meeting between the capo and the old families of Milan. It is an opportunity for him to finalize the old treaty and secure his position. He will tell you it is business. It is a choice, ragazza. Do not confuse your light with his survival." The message was a cruel, perfectly timed strike, a psychological attack. It didn't threaten violence. It threatened the fundamental truth of Becky's place in Fred's world. It brought the cold, hard reality of the Mafia's political necessity back to the forefront. Becky's hands trembled as she placed the necklace back in the box. She knew the truth of Fred's love, but the Contessa's words planted a poisonous seed of doubt. He will always need an equal, not a comfort. That evening, Fred returned, his expression grim. He walked straight to the office, his usual greeting a low, intense silence. "I need to go to Milan," he announced, his voice flat. "The old families have requested a formal meeting. It is about the treaty, the one Julian initiated. It is necessary to end this conflict permanently." Becky looked at him, her gaze unwavering, but her voice held a new, carefully controlled reserve. "Is the Contessa arranging this meeting, Fred?" Fred froze. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing in surprise at her sudden, uncharacteristic coldness. "How do you know that name? Who told you?" Becky walked to the chest and lifted the diamond necklace, its jewels catching the light like frozen tears. She handed him the note. Fred read the letter, his jaw tightening with controlled fury. He crumpled the paper in his hand, his eyes blazing with a protective rage that was aimed at the Contessa's audacity. "She is trying to manipulate me," Fred stated, his voice low and dangerous. "She is trying to use my duty against my desire. The treaty is meaningless. I am going there to shut down her interference once and for all. Or to make a choice," Becky countered, her voice steady. "She is offering you an exchange, the old, necessary life for the new, vulnerable one. You chose me over her, Fred. But the world you command is still demanding a Contessa." Fred walked to her, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, absolute command. "The world is wrong, Becky. The world can demand what it wants. I command the world. The only choice I make is you." He lowered his head and claimed her lips in a kiss that was a mix of intense passion and desperate reassurance. He was fighting the world for her, and she was the only thing that gave him the strength to fight. "I will go to Milan," Fred declared, his eyes blazing with a final, unbreakable resolve. "But I will not go to make a choice. I will go to make an end. And when I return, I will bring the proof that no one, not even the old families, can come between us." He looked at the necklace in her hand. He gently took it from her, his touch almost reverent. "I will not let her trinket poison your mind. This belongs to my mother. You belong to me." He then walked to the safe, opened it, and placed the diamond necklace inside. "I will return with a ring that is not a treaty, but a vow." The morning Fred left for Milan was the hardest morning Becky had endured since the attack. The house felt empty, the protection of the guards inadequate. She was facing the ultimate test of her faith in him, a choice that would define the rest of their lives. She poured all her restless energy into her studies, using the focused discipline Fred admired. She was not the desperate girl waiting for rescue. She was the partner preparing for a new era. She worked late into the night, but the silence of the house was a heavy blanket of isolation. In the command center, she accessed the secure line to Marco. "I need you to tell me everything that happens in Milan," she ordered, her voice professional and firm. "I don't need generalities. I need names, numbers, and the exact terms of the treaty. I need to know the price of the choice Fred is making." Marco, impressed by her cold, focused command, agreed instantly. Becky spent the next 2 days tracking the movements of the old families, analyzing the proposed treaty terms, and building a contingency plan. She realized the Contessa was not offering a legitimate partnership. She was offering a subtle, complex betrayal designed to weaken Fred's financial power while bolstering his image. Becky compiled the data into a single, devastating report. She knew Fred would never betray her, but the world he commanded was a master of deceit. She sent the report to Marco with a single command: "Show this to Fred only after he has rejected the treaty. It is his insurance against the Contessa's inevitable retaliation." On the third evening, the safe house alarms blared, a sudden, violent cacophony that broke the silence. Becky ran to the command center, her heart pounding. The guards were already on high alert, shouting orders into their radios. The threat was external, a surprise attack orchestrated by the Venetian family who had aligned with Julian. A last, desperate attempt to weaken the capo's position while he was away. Becky's instincts took over. She didn't panic. She walked to the security panel, her financial mind now focused on military strategy. She directed the guards, using the building's defensive layout, cutting off the main access points, and coordinating the security response with the cold efficiency of a seasoned commander. She was not the innocent victim anymore. She was the capo's defense. The attack was repelled quickly, the enemy forces retreating, surprised by the house's sophisticated, coordinated response. Marco called moments later, his voice filled with awe. "It's over, Signorina. Your command saved us. You are truly the queen." Becky hung up, her hands trembling with a mix of adrenaline and quiet triumph. She had faced the darkest truth of the Mafia, and won. She was the one who was truly ready to be the capo's equal. The battle at the safe house had been a defining moment. When Fred's private jet landed back on the compound airstrip, he was met not only by Marco, but by the entire security detail, all of whom spoke of Becky's command with a new, reverent respect. Fred walked into the command center, his face grim, and found Becky sitting at the main console, reviewing the damage report. She was exhausted, but her composure was absolute. She looked up, her eyes clear and unwavering. "The Venetian attack was a response to the Contessa's interference," Becky stated, her voice calm and professional. "She was the distraction. The true threat remains the internal structure that allows the old families to question your authority. I have compiled the full report of the Contessa's proposal, a financial trap designed to weaken your control. Marco has it." Fred walked to her. He did not ask about her safety. He simply saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the unwavering strength in her posture. He knelt beside her chair, a massive, powerful man humbling himself before his queen. "The treaty is finished, Becky," Fred stated, his voice a low, fierce vow. "I walked into that room, and I saw only the political cost. I rejected the entire proposal. I told them that the era of political marriages and empty treaties is over. My loyalty is to the family's stability, and my stability is a woman with a mind sharper than any weapon. That was my truth." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her palm. "Marco informed me about the attack. You commanded the defense, Mia Regina. You saved my men, you saved my home, and you saved my reign. You are not a comfort, Becky. You are the ultimate weapon." He paused, his eyes blazing with a final absolute resolve. "I have no more choices to make. The only thing left is a declaration." Fred pulled her from the chair and walked her out onto the balcony, where the city lights glittered below. The cold night air was clean, a stark contrast to the danger they had faced. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, holding her close, their combined silhouette a powerful image of unified command. "The capo must have a publicly acknowledged queen," Fred announced, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Not a mistress, not a secretary, a queen. And I will give you a kingdom that is not of bloodshed, but of absolute, peaceful security." He led her back inside. He walked to the safe, not the one that held his mother's locket, but the one that held his most guarded possessions. He opened it and retrieved a small velvet box. He knelt before her, his powerful frame humbled in the most profound act of devotion. "Becky," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I am a ruthless man who commands in the shadows. I do not offer a life of simple ease, but a life of eternal protection. You are the only person who sees my good heart and my dark soul. You are my only truth, my only reason for peace, and my only reason for war." He opened the box. Inside lay a single, stunning ring, a massive antique sapphire, the color of his eyes, surrounded by a crown of flawless, clear diamonds. It was a ring of royal command, not romantic fluff. "Marry me, Becky," he commanded, the question an absolute order of devotion. "Be my queen. Be my shield. Be my light. I will never ask you to leave the shadows, but I promise you that in my darkness, you will always be safe." Tears streamed down Becky's face, tears of joy, relief, and the overwhelming certainty of their destiny. She knelt before him, placing her hands on his cheeks, honoring his vulnerable act. "Yes, Fred," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I will be your queen. I will be your shield. I will be your truth." Fred did not smile. He simply slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger, rising with a sudden, decisive grace. He kissed her. A long, deep, final kiss of pure, consuming possession. 1 year later, the sapphire ring on Becky's hand was a quiet, potent symbol of her absolute power. The Mafia had been silenced, reorganized, and modernized. Becky was no longer simply the capo's wife. She was the financial strategist, the woman who handled every detail of the family's legitimate power, freeing Fred to remain the feared shadow that kept the city in check. The old families, defeated by her intelligence and Fred's loyalty, now sent their daughters to study at the colleges Becky once dreamed of attending. The safe house had finally become a home. It was filled with books, art, and the quiet comfort of a life built on trust. Julian was a distant, forgotten memory, his fate a permanent warning against betrayal. The Contessa was married off to an old, harmless European family, her influence permanently neutralized. One afternoon, Becky stood in the private library, reviewing a complex financial ledger, a new expansion plan for one of the family's legal holdings. Fred walked in, dressed in a casual cashmere sweater, his formidable presence softened by the comfort of his home. He walked to her, placing a cup of tea on the desk, then gently stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Are you happy, Mia Regina?" he asked, his voice a low, daily affirmation of his devotion. Becky leaned back, resting her head against his chest. She looked down at the complex ledger she was controlling, then up at the man who commanded the city. "I am safe, Fred. I am challenged. I am loved, and I am necessary. I found my power in your darkness. I am exactly where I was meant to be." She turned, rising on her toes to kiss him, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of their shared future. "I chose the capo, and the capo chose me." Fred returned the kiss with a fierce, possessive intensity, his powerful arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her off her feet. "You chose the capo, and I chose the only light I will ever need," he murmured against her lips. He carried her out of the library, the financial reports left open on the desk, a silent testament to the fact that the work was never done. But the ultimate prize was always close. The story of the simple secretary who became the Mafia queen was over, but the reign had just begun. A life of perpetual, dangerous romance, sealed by the love of the most terrifying, devoted man in the world.